Oh, okay, she did set it up automatically. Thank you, Bobby.
She's a good woman.
She wants to see it.
Fair.
Damn, I'm in a meeting. Wow, a lot of people. Okay, welcome folks. We're going to wait about 2 or 3 minutes because a lot of people have registered for this webinar.
I'm sure someone smarter than me knows, but I don't know if there's a gatekeeper and they can only add so quickly.
Yeah, I don't know, but they're coming in real fast.
They are coming in fast.
Mm-hmm. Someone has commented that people have shared this webinar notice, and we're glad you have. Okay, we'll give it 1 more minute.
All right.
And then we'll start.
People are still coming in from their gardens. It's still light outside.
I'd be out there if I could.
I think that's where the rest of my family is at the moment.
I hope everybody got a chance to be gardening today. Oh, somebody's here from Tennessee. Wow, people are from all over the country. It's very interesting.
Where else have we got people from?
Tennessee. There are lots and lots of them. Tennessee, all over New Jersey, of course. East Tennessee, New Jersey Shore, Rochester, New York, Maryville, Tennessee, Kirksville, Missouri, Brooklyn, of course. Spring Lake Heights, I don't know where that is. Is that in New Jersey? A lot of people from Tennessee. Interesting. Somebody says Randi is a star, which she certainly is. Okay, we're going to start. Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Elaine Silverstein, co-leader of the Bergen Passaic chapter. Welcome to our April meeting, which is the last meeting that will be on Zoom for quite some time. We are going to be having in-person meetings outdoors throughout the warm months, starting with, sorry, I have 2 pages here. Starting with, there are 2 events, and these would have been in the newsletter that you got, which we will send out again. One is on Wednesday, May 18th, starting at 5 p.m. And one is on Monday, May 23rd, starting at 10 a.m. And again, look at our newsletter for the details. We also are going to be doing tabling events at the Bergen Zoo Party for the Planet on April 24th. And at the Bergen County Audubon Society Native Plant Day, which is on Sunday, May 15th at DePort Park. If anybody in the chapter would like to help us out with those tabling events, we could really appreciate it. We had a volunteer on Sunday at the Ridgewood event, and it was terrific. It was really wonderful having an extra person, and we had lots and lots of people coming out. It's a lot of fun to stand there all day and talk about native plants. It really is. So please let us know if you can help. Also, on April 24th, unfortunately, there's a conflict with another thing we're doing, but it is the first Habitat Helpers Work Day at the New York, New Jersey Trail Conference. And our chapter has worked with and been affiliated with the Trail Conference since its inception. So if you can come out on that day, you register at the Trail Conference headquarters. Again, this will be in our newsletter. Please register, please come out. I will be there. It's lots of fun. And there's usually some free plants that you wind up with. Also, as a reminder, please join the Native Plant Society of New Jersey if you're not already a member. There are lots and lots of terrific webinars that we have been doing since COVID started, and lots of other great events if you hook up with a local chapter. There are 15 active chapters, I think, now, covering the entire state. Last but not least, it is my great pleasure to introduce Madam President, Dr. Randi Eckel. Randi was recently installed as president of the Native Plant Society of New Jersey, and we have been very lucky to have her come as a speaker just about every year for the past, who knows how many years, in April or May. And I think, as everybody knows, Randi holds a PhD in entomology, and she is the owner of Toadshade Wildflower Farm, which sells only native plants that are grown on site. And it's a mail order nursery. So with very little further ado, I just want to, I want to just thank Randi for coming and to introduce her, and everybody I think is very excited about this presentation. So Randi, please take it from here. Oh, one more thing. If you have questions, put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat. It's just a little bit easier to look through them, and we will. I'll read the questions to Randi as when she pauses or at the end. So just remember to type your questions in the Q&A. Thank you very much, Randi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elaine. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm excited. We have people from all over the place. I think we should encourage those people from Tennessee to join the Essex, the Bergen Passaic chapter of the NPSNJ, don't you? I think they might have a tough commute to the tabling events. But regardless, good evening, everyone. I think everyone's just barely in from gardening. It is a beautiful day here. And I'm going to talk about native ground covers. Sustainable living mulch. I'm going to have an opportunity to get up on a little bit of a soapbox this evening on the subject of mulch. So sit back and I hope you enjoy this. This, by the way, is purple phacelia, which is quite rare here in New Jersey. This picture was taken down in North Carolina in Asheville. See if I can get my slides to advance. That would always be a bonus. Let's see here. Oh, come on now, let's advance, shall we?
You put it on.
There we go. There we go. I've got it. So why do we mulch? Why do we use mulch at all? We use mulch to prevent soil erosion, suppress weeds, minimize moisture and temperature fluctuations, and to slowly add organic matter to the soil. These are all fine things to do in our gardens. Once upon a time, not that long ago, wood chip mulch, dead mulch, was something that you used in a new garden. It was an immature garden. It was a tool that you used just until you were able to cover the ground with actual plants. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, great beds of mulch were not a landscape feature. They were simply a temporary indication. If you had a lot of mulch, it meant you had a very new garden. It didn't mean that the mulch itself was somehow a feature. Plants are meant to live in plant communities. They want to be next to other plants. They want to support one another. In doing so, they provide wildlife habitat, and they hold each other up. Plants set in a sea of mulch, they're isolated, they're unsupported, they often fall over because there's no other plants next to them. Sometimes people get stressed out They have specimen plantings in a sea of mulch, and they get upset because the lower leaves off their plant start falling off or turning yellow. That's because in the natural world, they should have other plants underneath them taking up that shady space. And they would only be using their upper leaves because the lower space would be taken over by other plants that belong in the lower part of the canopy. So the wood chip mulch business has done a great job of creating this idea that we need to rake away everything out of our gardens every year. Every stem, every scrap of old mulch, every leaf, getting rid of that and buy wood chip from them, wood chip mulch, and putting it on our gardens. Twice a year, ideally, once in the spring, once in the fall. What we're doing when we're doing that, other than the fact that we're spending lots and lots and lots of money on wood chip mulch, is we're actively removing the living creatures from our gardens, such as this spice bush swallowtail pupa. This is the overwintering form of a spice bush swallowtail butterfly. And here it is attached to a stem, which should stay standing in the garden all winter. But if it's removed and sent to the garbage, then we've removed our overwintering butterfly. It's a form of a butterfly from our garden. This treadmill of mulching our gardens twice a year, it creates a lot of extra cost. It creates a lot of extra effort. And let's think about sustainability. Where do all those wood chips come from? Well, many of the dyed wood chips, I will tell you, come from wood scrap from construction, old pallets. Many landfills, laws were passed in the last 10, 20 years, where landfills will not accept construction debris. So they grind up the construction debris, which has a certain environmental appeal. It's very, very dry. It's not very attractive. So they dye it fabulous colors so that it looks more attractive in our gardens. But really where that wood is sourced from is anyone's idea. We have no idea the history of the wood that's going in there. When you're buying big piles of wood chip mulch, most of it is not coming from downed trees up the road from you. That's referred to as arborist's mulch. I've used it myself. Nothing wrong with arborist mulch. When I've had dead trees taken down on my property and they chip the other upper branches, I wind up with my own pile of arborist mulch. But arborist mulch has its own problems associated with it. When tree trimming crews work along a roadside and they're trimming whatever is in the way, they're also trimming poison ivy and running that through the wood chip mulcher. I am here to tell you, when I was 22 years old, I can tell you that you can get a really amazing case of poison ivy from moving wood chip mulch that has chipped up poison ivy plants in it. It was the first time I actually got poison ivy, had poison ivy up both arms from carrying huge arm loads of poison ivy contaminated wood chip mulch. Also, black walnut contaminated wood chip mulch. I love black walnut trees. They're wonderful. They do contain juglone, and there are certain plants that will not grow when juglone is present. So all wood chips are not the same, and they're really not very sustainable in the long run. More to the point, what lives on wood chip mulch? Wood chip mulch is not a garden. A garden is living things. Wood chip mulch is dead wood chips. There's very few things that live on wood chip mulch. Here are 4 of them, the 4 main ones actually. So in the left-hand side of the screen here at the bottom, there's the western dusky slug. Slugs and snails love wood chip mulch, and they will cruise around on it and feed on the decaying matter there. The second one over is artillery fungus. And I actually want you to, let's see if I can find my pointer here. I want you to compare this with this here. This is bird's nest fungus. Bird's nest fungus really likes wood chip mulch. You can see where it looks like little bird's nests here. They're only about the size of a pencil eraser. They're pretty small. Artillery fungus is much, much smaller than that. It is maybe half the size of that. These are actually quite tiny. But the reason it's called artillery fungus or shotgun fungus is it shoots little black spores that attach themselves to anything. This is a photo from Rutgers Extension. And these are these little black spores. You can see this is a trowel for size measurement that are stuck to the siding of a house. Artillery fungus spores attach themselves extremely well. I believe it's Mike McGrath who likes to make a joke about the fact that they particularly seem to like sticking to things, not only your siding, but things like white sports cars. They can shoot those spores up to 30 feet. And they are a devil to get off your siding, to get off your car. They'll even leave the spores stuck to other plants. And the other thing down here, you know, who doesn't want a garden with dog vomit fungus growing in it? Really, really. These are the main things that are going to grow in your sea of mulch. Wood chip mulch is not a garden. It's a single food source of dead organic matter. There's a lack of diversity there. And it's really not a garden. So let's talk about living mulch. It does all the same things as wood chip mulch does. It protects the soil from erosion. The foliage breaks up the rainfall before it hits the ground, and the roots help hold the soil, which is something that wood chip mulch cannot do. Living mulch cools the soil, just like standing under a tree on a hot day or a big tree in your yard cools your yard. Ground covers keep the soil cooler. It conserves moisture by keeping water from evaporating. And it prevents weeds by outcompeting weed seedlings. It also adds organic matter to the soil over time. Because when you have living mulch, you don't need to rake it and clear it out every year. You let it stay. But it also provides ecological services. So we have flowers that support pollinators. It self-perpetuates. It's host plants for butterflies and all kinds of moths and other creatures. It provides habitat for wildlife. And it beautifies the space in ways that wood chip mulch simply does not. I would argue that the ground cover layer is, in modern gardens, is the most neglected portion of many landscape designs. You know, we create these designs with just little shrubs here and there, little perennials here and there, and then we cover the rest of it with wood chip mulch. When what we should be doing is thinking of that as simply a different layer of our garden, where we have a canopy, we have a mid-story, and then we have the ground cover layer. And if we have some leaves in our yard, we use those, rake those into the garden. Don't get rid of them, keep those. This is what we've been believed what a finished landscape should look like. This is from University of New Hampshire Extension. This is not what a garden should look like. Plants should be next to each other, not isolated. This is what we want. This is sustainable. This is the Eastern wildflower display at the Denver Botanic Gardens. It has ground covers. It has all the different layers of the garden. There is not a sea of mulch here. These are plants growing next to one another, supporting one another, and creating habitat. What are some of the things we need to consider when we think about choosing a living mulch? Well, they're all the same sort of things when we think about any plant that's going to go into our gardens. You know, what kind of moisture do I have? What kind of sun do I have? Is the soil rich or not so rich? Do you want to or need a competitive ground cover? One of the problems with living ground covers, it's not really a problem, it's a perception problem with living ground covers, is a lot of people want a ground cover, a native ground cover. They want to put it in, they want to have it fill the garden very, very quickly. And then they want it to stop at the edge of where you think your garden's going to be. You can't have both of those things. No plant, native or not, understands where the edge of the garden is supposed to be that you have put in place. What height do you want or need? Ground covers actually come in quite a variety of sizes. When I was in college many, many years ago, all the ground covers were very, very short, but now we find that we can actually create ground covers with quite a bit more height and still fill in that niche in the garden. And other special considerations. Again, these are special considerations that you would think about with any garden area. Do you have roadway or walkway or driveway salt runoff? Do you need a salt tolerant species? And what about foot traffic? Is this an area where someone's going to walk? I was at the same event with Elaine on Sunday, and someone asked me if I would talk a little bit about steppable ground covers during this presentation, and I did add in a little information on that. So as some of the plants go by, when I start discussing specific species, I will be talking about some of them that are steppable and you can use in a garden where you're expecting some foot traffic. So there are lots and lots of plants that can be used as native ground covers. So many choices. If you choose ones that are adapted to your soil and your sun, they will thrive and they will support wildlife, like this meadow fritillary butterfly here on a white pine. I'm not going to be able to talk about all the great plants that you can use as ground covers, but I'm going to talk about some that I'm particularly fond of, or perhaps some that you haven't thought about before, thought about as a ground cover. And as always, I'm going to start with one of my absolute favorites, which are the violets. Violets are the host plant of meadow fritillary butterflies. It is the only host that they can use. So I'm going to talk about common blue violets. In New Jersey, I don't remember off the top of my head, I think we have something like 27 different species of violet, which are native to New Jersey. They flower in the spring. They're host plants to fritillaries. They're deer resistant. They're perfectly happy with foot traffic. They're very easy to grow. Will they spread and possibly spread into your lawn? Yes, yes, they will. Common blue violets will absolutely spread into your lawn. But why are flowers in the lawn a bad idea? When did we decide that? The way that great spangled fritillaries and meadow fritillaries lay their eggs, they both rely on violets. They scatter their eggs distribution, which is exactly the way that common blue violets and other native violets grow. The butterflies have co-evolved with those plants so that the plants are where the butterflies need them. Back in the early 1900s, having a lawn that didn't flower was actually considered very bad form. Somewhere in the middle of the 1900s, we decided that lawns had to be a solid stand of nothing but grass. Perhaps it has been suggested that this obsession with solid green lawns came about when the Masters tournament was first broadcast on television in color. Perhaps that's true. But what we do now is we create these huge swaths of lawn, primarily made of Kentucky bluegrass, which, despite the name, is not native to North America. It's native to Europe and North Africa and Northern Asia. So allow some common blue violets in your lawn. My lawn is a riot of color right now. I have both common blues and Confederate violets blooming. There are other violets, of course, the striped cream violet, which I'm extremely fond of. This is actually an evergreen violet. Not so good with foot traffic as the common blue violet. It's also a fritillary host plant. Here I have it growing as a ground cover in a side garden. This is a very shady garden in the spring and then moves towards sun during the summer. But there's some Christmas fern in the back there as well as some Jeffersonia in the back left. There's also some wild hydrangea, sorry, not wild hydrangea, whoops, wood geranium there in the back. But most of those white flowers, all of those white flowers that you see in the foreground there, those are all striped cream violet. It's a late spring flowering violet, which works very well to fill in a woodland garden. Wild basil, in contrast, is an excellent full sun plant. It will take a little bit of shade. A lot of great ground covers will take a little bit of shade because they're going to be in that lower level of the garden. But this will fill out very nice in a cottage garden, in a meadow garden. It is deer resistant. It's extremely drought tolerant and attracts a lot of butterflies and bees to the flowers, which flower in series. You see each of these flower heads eventually has more than 25 flowers on it, but only maybe 4, 5, 6 of them flower at any given time. So it actually has a very long bloom period as well. Lyre-leaf sage is a really interesting one. This was one I first saw when I was living in North Carolina. It will take quite dry soil. It will take a lot of sun. It grows to about 2 feet tall, 1 to 2 feet tall, but that's really just the flower spire. The foliage stays quite flat to the ground, and it's quite tolerant of foot traffic. We have some of this in our meadow, and it is growing not only in the meadow, but also in the pathway of our meadow, where it gets walked on all the time and occasionally mowed when the pathway gets a little bit raggedy. It's a really excellent plant, and it does attract both butterflies and hummingbirds to the flowers. It has a long bloom period and will rebloom all summer long. Sedges, a word about sedges. I don't have a lot of slides in here about sedges, but one of the things that I think is really neglected in a lot of gardens is just as a class of plants is people don't think about sedges. There are quite a variety of sedges with broad leaves, with narrow leaves. Some sedges are quite tall, some are quite short, some will take quite a lot of shade, some will tolerate a lot of sun. They're all deer resistant. Deer really are not very fond of sedges. If you run your finger along the edge of a sedge leaf, it tends to feel a little bit rough. The botanical saying that sedges have edges simply refers to that rough edge. Hop sedge in particular, this one likes quite a bit of moisture, but will take average soil as well. Flowers in early summer, and these seed heads are persistent. These attractive seed heads are persistent for quite a long time. A sedge that you may be more familiar with is Pennsylvania sedge. Excellent ground cover. It only grows to be about 10 inches tall, so you get this sort of cascading effect. It is in flower right now, spreads by rhizomes, so it fills in very nicely and tolerates quite a lot of shade. It's deer resistant. It will take some foot traffic. I did not put that on this slide because it does tend to get matted down if you walk on it too much, but it will take a little bit of traffic. And it is quite, although it's quite happy with a lot of moisture, it is quite drought tolerant as well. I have noticed one area that I've been experimenting with it is a very, very dry area right underneath a flowering dogwood. And it is not as dense as it is here. This is a rather moister area at Bowman's Hill Wildflower Preserve. But in the drier area, it is yet spreading and filling in. It's just not as dense as this. Ferns. I love Maidenhair Fern. This is at Mount Cuba. actually, in Delaware. Ferns make a really nice ground cover, particularly the evergreen ferns. Christmas fern that you saw on an earlier slide in the background when I was talking about the striped cream violet. It's a particularly nice ground cover because it does have the evergreen character. But the ferns also are going to almost to a one be deer resistant. I did hear someone recently tell me that the deer had gone after their ferns. It's the first that I've heard of deer going after ferns very much. But if you have enough moisture, ferns are always a nice idea. And even some of the ferns, like sensitive fern, will actually take it quite dry. One of the things that many of the ferns will not take is too intense sunlight. So you are going to want to put them someplace, most of them, where they get from part shade to full shade, not out in the blistering sun. This is one that I put in based on the conversation that I had this weekend. This is path rush. As the name would imply, if you need a ground cover that you can walk on, path rush is your plant. It only grows to be about 12 inches tall. This is a close-up of it with a rock behind, so you can see what the seed heads look like. This is just starting to go to seed. It is not a very soft brush. The stems are a little bit wiry. They're not unpleasant to walk on in bare feet, but they're not particularly soft either. But this is an excellent and incredibly tough and drought tolerant plant that can be used both in gardens. It forms tufts, which can be very attractive, or it can be used someplace in a path area where you want to mow infrequently at best. It's an excellent choice for someplace that's going to get a lot of foot traffic or dog traffic or what have you. Northern dropseed. This is one of my favorite ones. We don't tend to think of, we're sort of coming off the sedges and rushes. We don't tend to think of necessarily the grasses as ground covers, but they really make an excellent choice. This is, both of these shots actually are at Penn State's Arboretum. And you can see it has sort of the tufting form, but then when it flowers in late summer and the foliage starts turning color, this is when it really, really starts to show off, because you get these great reds and bronzes with these airy panicles. Makes an excellent ground cover. It's the ground cover actually that was in the slide very early on when I showed you that there was common milkweed and northern dropseed next to each other, supporting each other in a formal planting that had no ground showing at all. This is a special one that I really quite like. This is hairy woodrush. It does not get very tall. At the best of times, it gets to be 1.5 feet tall, but in reality, it usually stays under 1 foot tall. It is semi-evergreen and turns a lovely shade of burgundy in the winter. It's deer resistant. It will take average soil. It is normally found in the wild where it's quite moist. It's also acid tolerant, so it'll take some very acid soil. And the photo, the inset there, that was taken really with sort of laying down and looking up at it to try to give you a sense of what the flower heads looked like. But this is a beautiful ground cover that really fills in all year round, which is really a bonus in any of these ground covers, something that gives you something to look at through the winter months as well. And I just really like the burgundy color that it turns both in the winter and into the spring through the flowering period. Pussy toes. This is a patch of pussy toes that we found on our property when we moved here over 28 years ago. This happens to be plant and leaf pussy toes. There are some other species of pussy toes. There's Antonaria howleyi, Antonaria neglecta, the neglected pussy toes. They are a beautiful ground cover. They are not particularly aggressive, and they're not going to really outcompete very many weeds. It's really not their style. But once they're established, they will hold their own. They're host of the American Painted Lady Butterfly. They will take foot traffic, particularly the neglected pussy toes, Antonaria neglecta. But even plant and leaf pussy toes and the others will take some foot traffic. They're deer resistant, and they put up these adorable little flowers in the spring, from what they get their name from, that look like, I suppose, cat's paws, from what they get their name. The silvery foliage is beautiful all season long, and it is semi-evergreen. I always have to back up when I talk about things that are semi-evergreen. It usually means that they stay green through the winter, right up until about now in the spring, when the old leaves get really tired looking and they're done and they start putting new leaves on. But it's ours is in bud and is going to be flowering in about 2 weeks here, I expect. Now, purple Avens, this is a beautiful ground cover. If you've got a moist to wet area where you're trying to crowd out some other weeds, crowd out some other plants, where you need a dense ground cover to really make a presence and take up some space, this is a wonderful ground cover. Actually, all the Avens, all the Guillaumes are excellent ground covers. I think we have 3 or 4 of them now at the nursery that we grow. And they all make really excellent ground covers. The purple Avens likes it wetter than most of them and does have this quite flashy flower. Actually, it's a nodding flower, but the flower is more than an inch across, probably 1.5 inches across. It's a really nice one, and I really do strongly advocate this one for situations where people are struggling to find a ground cover that'll fill a space that's quite moist. This one always makes me think of my mother. When I was a kid, we had coral bells that had belonged to my grandmother. And my mother carefully tended her mother's coral bells. And when I moved, she gave me some of my grandmother's coral bells to put in my garden. And I didn't know that they were simply heucheras. I didn't realize that they were, yes, they were cultivars of a native plant. But we actually have several different native straight species, alum roots, heucheras, that are beautiful in their own right without having any cultivars done to them at all. This is American alum root. There's also hairy alum root, which is a more southern species, Heuchera villosa. There's Heuchera longostigma. There's a lot of beautiful heucheras out there, some of which have different shades in the foliage. The longostigma actually has silvery centers on the leaves. These are really beautiful ground covers. The biggest problem that I have found with this is not that the deer have gone after them, but for reasons which I find strange and mysterious, something sometimes goes after the buds in the winter. They recover from it, but they chew down on the buds. And I don't know if it's mice or rabbits, but something does like the buds. So although it is deer resistant, there is someone else that likes to chew on them during the winter months, but they do recover from that. They're quite drought tolerant. And they do attract lots of very tiny little native bees that go to the flowers. This is one most people know about. Wary's foam flower, Tiarella cordifolia. Flowers in spring, has maple-shaped leaves. Average to moist soil, sun to part shade. It's a lovely plant. As I said, most people know about this one. I actually rather prefer two-leaf mitrewort, Mitella diphylla. I find it to be, the foliage to be a bit brighter. It's just as floriferous and seems to attract, to my eye, seems to attract more butterflies than the Tiarella does. This is a juniper hair streak. Calophrys grunius, which, as the name might imply, the host plant of this butterfly are our native junipers, like northern red cedar. Golden ragwort. Now this, if you've got enough moisture, this can be a great ground cover to fill a lot of space and fill it very well. If any of you were in on the webinar that I gave with Bobby Herbs last summer about her gardens, she put in some golden ragwort, and she had a very moist garden to start with, and the golden ragwort did exceptionally well and filled in perhaps a bit more than she would have wanted it to. In a drier situation, it behaves itself much more. It is a glorious ground cover because it does fill in very nicely, shoots up with these beautiful yellow flowers in the fairly early spring, and then the flowering stems simply collapse. You don't need to deadhead them or take anything away. They simply collapse and fall down and sort of integrate themselves into the leaves below. It's a very excellent ground cover, both clay and acid soil tolerant, and it is also deer resistant. One of the interesting things about golden ragwort, and this, I assume this is why the deer don't care for it, is that if you actually work with the plants themselves, particularly if you disturb the root at all or the crown, give off quite a lovely, actually very sweet smell. And I think that's what keeps the deer at bay on this particular species. Creeping phlox is quite nice. Flux Stalinifera. It has evergreen basal foliage, which, as far north as we are, it is more evergreen in winters with better snow cover. This past winter, we did not have particularly great snow cover. So the evergreen part of the foliage did not have a particularly good winter, but they are just getting ready to flower, and then they will put on new foliage as they always do. It is also drought and acid soil tolerant. A lot of woodland wildflowers are acid soil tolerant because naturally woodland soils are often slightly acid from the decomposing leaves. Moss phlox is one that a lot of people know because people grow this in their lawns. Again, flowers in the lawn. This is a good thing. It is evergreen. It is very short. It is deer resistant. You can walk on it some. It thrives in very poor soil. It thrives in terrible soil. It grows at the top of cliffs. It grows over top of rocks. This is a very, very, very tough plant. Similar to this one, which most of you are probably not aware of. This is Starry Serastium, Serastium arvens. This is a native chickweed. Don't everyone back away. All the chickweeds that are weeds in your garden, those are not native. Serastium arvens is a native chickweed, and it is a true and beautiful evergreen. This picture that you're looking at with the leaves on it in the background, that was taken at Christmas. It's getting ready to flower now. The flowers are fragrant. It's host plant to the chickweed geometer, which is a beautiful, beautiful little moth. And the flowers are so fragrant. They are so lovely. Where I live, these flowers actually grow on the cliffs along the Delaware River, the rocky cliffs along the Delaware River, and flower every spring. A very, very tough ground cover. Wild strawberry is also a fairly tough ground cover. There's a lot of people who think they have wild strawberry. What they have is usually Indian mock strawberry. Wild strawberry flowers white. And the fruits, if you can find them, tend to be very small and very, very tasty. The reason I say if you can find them is just like garden strawberries. The wildlife tends to get all the wild strawberries. This plant was actually used as a parent to create what we grow as garden strawberries, what we eat as garden strawberries. But it does make an excellent ground cover. It will spread just like a garden strawberry and produce new plants at the tips. This can be mixed very effectively with sedges, for example, or something else to create a multi-level ground cover. Wild ginger is often recommended as a ground cover, a Asarum canadense, and I don't deny that it is a beautiful ground cover. It is, under most conditions, it is fairly slow growing. Unless you have fairly moist soil, it is going to grow fairly slowly. And although it is, excuse me, although it is often listed as deer resistant, I'm only going to say it's mostly deer resistant. I can tell you that some of the deer in my neighborhood missed that memo about it being deer resistant, and they will occasionally feed on it, which doesn't really speed up the spreading of it in my dry soil where I grow up on, where I live up on top of the hill. It is an excellent ground cover. It is quite beautiful, but unless you have sufficient moisture, expect it to grow quite slowly. Now, this is a ground cover I really like that you don't see very many people talk about. This is Starry False Solomon Seal. A lot of people are familiar with Solomon's Plume, which is Myanthemum racenosum. Solomon's Plume gets a very large cluster of flowers about the size of my fist, which turns into a large cluster of berries the size of my fist, which invariably weighs down the plant, and the whole plant winds up doing a face plant in the soil. Starry False Solomon Seal is more delicate than Solomon's Plume. It has a smaller cluster of flowers at the end. You usually get maybe 10 to 12 berries at the end of each of these that are striped with burgundy. Hence, it stays upright. It's quite drought tolerant, actually. It will take average to moist soil, but I can tell you that one of the areas that I have it in is quite droughty, and it's doing quite well in an area that gets quite a bit of sun. It has backed off a little bit from the hottest, driest area and is moving itself. It spreads by rhizome. It's moving itself into an area with just a little bit more shade. We lost a tree last year, which has changed our light a little bit on our property, but is very beautiful ground cover that I would recommend probably for ideally a part shade situation. Spreading's Jacob's Ladder is beautiful. It does, under some conditions, tend to go down in the early summer and then re-sprout the leaves, and that's something to be aware of. Some of these perennial ground covers are not necessarily 12-month ground covers. So like any other perennial garden, you need to plan to make sure that you have some plants that are showing off at all times. Allegheny Spurge is our native Pachysandra. A lot of times, particularly when we have plants with similar common names, we want them to look just like the non-native that we're going to be replacing. So for example, Pachysandra procumbens, Allegheny Spurge, like, oh, it's the native Pachysandra. I'll plant that instead of Japanese Pachysandra, and it will look exactly the same. Well, no, it's not going to look exactly the same. It's not the same plant. Allegheny Spurge is a beautiful ground cover, really terrific. It is not deer resistant, like the Japanese Pachysandra, which is an invasive species. And it also does not grow as densely as Japanese Pachysandra. I would, however, recommend that you give it a try because it is quite beautiful. Zigzag Goldenrod as a ground cover. This is at the Cornell Botanic Garden. I took a walk there one day in the rain. And this is in their Monday wildflower garden. This was an enormous area of their woods. The whole area was just zigzag goldenrod. It was simply stunning. It was in full bloom. It's deer resistant and attracts butterflies. This is Solidago flexicollis is actually a very, shall I say, well-behaved goldenrod. It does spread by rhizomes, but very short rhizomes. It doesn't grow very tall. It's not an aggressive goldenrod, but it is really stunning in mass in a woodland setting. Canadian anemone, in the right situation, can be quite aggressive. Here it's mixed with some ferns and even some equisetum. It's just stunning. It's one of my favorite ground covers. It grows to be about 2 feet tall. I will tell you that in very dry, deep shade, it is not aggressive. It's almost shy in very dry, deep shade. But given enough moisture, it fills in beautifully, and you get this stunning display of flowers. Fringe bleeding heart is a beautiful ground cover, but you do need to have at least average moisture for this. It will flower spring through the fall if you have sufficient moisture and rich soil. If you have dry soil, it will bloom briefly in the spring and then it will go dormant. It is allegedly deer resistant, but this highly depends on your deer. There are certainly some populations of deer, such as the ones in Hunterdon County where I am, that are quite fond of this plant. But I understand there are other areas, and I have it on good authority, that there are many areas where the deer will leave this entirely alone. I actually find this so much more attractive than the garden bleeding hearts that you find, which are mostly of Asian descent. These are small, they're delicate plants, they're beautiful. I find the other ones quite gaudy, quite frankly. Wild hairy petunia. When my daughter was little, this was one of her favorite plant names. She thought that wild hairy petunia just sounded like the cutest plant, and it is an adorable plant. It only grows to be about 1 foot tall. When the buds come up in the spring and the soil, they're already very fuzzy. It blooms over and over again. It's not a true petunia at all, but it certainly looks like one. Quite tolerant of clay and poor soil. This here, it's growing in sand down at Cape May Courthouse. It's a lovely little plant, and I will tell you that although not entirely deer resistant, it simply, if the deer nip off the top, it just branches and produces more flowers. So it's really what I would consider a deer tolerant plant. This is it. This is about August, I believe, when this picture was taken. This is a midsummer picture. Wild stonecrop, Sedum ternatum. I had fun talking to one of the folks with the New Jersey Heritage Program that was searching in New Jersey to try to find a population of where there was a wild stand of this. And I told him about the one that you're looking at. Actually, this is a huge stand of wild stonecrop growing over a stone wall next to a stream. It's a tough little evergreen. It only grows to be about 8 inches tall. It is host plant to the variegated fritillary. Now, the variegated fritillary will feed on violets. The caterpillars can grow on violets, but it will also lay its eggs on sedum that can also be a host plant for it. Wild stonecrop is very drought tolerant, and it will take a lot of different conditions. The only thing it won't take is full sun and very dry. I've tried it there and it struggles there. But as long as it gets part sun, it will take quite dry conditions. And I've even seen it growing on a rock in the middle of a stream. It will take all kinds of conditions, and it's just adorable. White wood aster, Arubia Divericotta. If you go to Central Park, and I have not been there at the right time to take this picture, they have rings around the trees of vegetation, and that is white wood aster. We have this typical, suburban tree circle up here where you've got the tree and you've got the dead zone around it with the dead mulch. Why? That's really not that attractive. We should put plants in that space. This picture in the back here, this is from Chicago Botanic Garden blog. This is white wood aster growing under gray birch in the gardens. It attracts butterflies and bees. It's drought tolerant. Really excellent source of fall nectar and pollen. Host plant to the pearl crescent. I'd like to tell you it was deer resistant. Not to the deer in Hunterdon County, it isn't. The deer in Hunterdon County will trim this down and keep it fairly short and nip it in the bud, but it is an excellent ground cover. Mayapple is a lot of people know about mayapple. It's a beautiful plant. But one of the cautions, and I made a point about this earlier, is that not all ground covers look great all year round. One of the advantages of mayapple, and which is just coming up now, is that in our area, is that mayapple, the plant is poisonous. The leaves are poisonous, the fruit is poisonous, right up until the fruit ripens in late July, early August, at which point the plants tend to collapse. In our area, Central Atlantic, they tend to get a rust disease. You get orange spots on the leaves and the leaves collapse down. So this would be a great ground cover to have in an area perhaps where it's also mixed with maybe some fall asters. So as your mayapple starts going down, your fall asters really start coming into their own and showing off. But it certainly is deer resistant up until that time. And the wildlife will really enjoy the fruits. Turkeys like the fruits, raccoons like the fruits, deer like the fruit. It's a beautiful woodland wildflower that makes a great ground cover. I know we've got some folks on from Tennessee. They'll probably appreciate this one, perhaps from more than the folks that are from New Jersey and north on this call. This is green and gold. It comes up to the northern end of its range and just in southern Pennsylvania. It just tips into Pennsylvania a little bit. It struggles in New Jersey. I know there are people who grow it successfully in South Jersey as a ground cover. The further north you get in New Jersey, it does tend to have, unless it's in a protected spot, it has some trouble, but it's a beautiful ground cover. This picture was taken at the Botanical Gardens at Asheville in North Carolina. It fills in a space very nicely by runners. Not particularly drought tolerant, more really requiring at least average moisture to moist soil, but it does stay very low. Lanceleaf loosestrife. This is a terrific ground cover. It will not necessarily stop at the edge of where you say the edge of your garden is, because it doesn't know where you said the edge of your garden is. Spreads by rhizomes under the soil. It's sandy and rocky soil tolerant. It's drought tolerant. Grows to be about 2 feet tall, and the foliage varies from green to burgundy, and it gets covered with these little yellow flowers in midsummer. We have this in a garden with both Starry Serastium and moss phlox that bloom earlier in the season, and then this sort of takes over, looking glorious in this direction as we go back to some milkweeds that are actually behind this in this particular garden. Forms really a ground cover underneath some common milkweeds. Northern Dewberry is a fun ground cover, but it's it's a really good one if you don't want people walking too much on the property. The prickers on Northern Dewberry, it's a ground running blackberry is what it is. The thorns are formidable, but if you've got a hillside, for example, that you would like a ground cover on that gets sufficient moisture, you can cover it beautifully with Northern Dewberry. It'll fill in very nicely and produce fruits for you and the wildlife as well. It's a really great nectar source. Wild Eastern Columbine, a lot of people are aware of the columbines. There's a lot of different garden columbines out there. The Wild Eastern Columbine is uniquely suited to support hummingbirds in the east. Hummingbirds, when they migrate north, they're usually migrating at exactly the same time that the Wild Eastern Columbines are coming into bud. It's a really important food source for the migrating hummingbirds. And of course, the yellow and red color is exactly what attracts the ruby-throated hummingbirds. shrubby five fingers, which used to be called three-tooth cinquefoil, which I always thought was a funny name because cinquefoil means 5 leaves. So the old name was three-toothed five finger. Anyhow, this is a great, really tough evergreen ground cover. It is slow growing. It is incredibly tough. This is taken up in Maine, out on Schutic Peninsula. So this area is brutally attacked by waves and sun and some really brutally cold weather. And it fills in really nicely between the rocks and the pathway. It has these beautiful white flowers as well. A really excellent, slow growing, but terrific ground cover. Elephant's foot. A lot of you probably have never heard of elephant's foot. It comes up late in the spring. It is actually very late in the spring before the leaves start showing above ground. But once it comes on, those large leaves, they cover the ground and they're really great at outcompeting weeds. It can well, with a little bit of help, with just a little bit of weeding, it can outcompete Japanese stiltgrass. It likes it moist, but it's perfectly happy with average to dry soil. And then it gets covered with these tiny purple flowers during the summer months, late summer months. Really excellent nectar source. It's a really terrific plant, which is easily grown by either transplants or seeds. The seeds are actually very easy to grow of this one. And dwarf crested iris. We don't tend to think of irises as a ground cover, but dwarf crested irises only grow to be about 8 inches tall. Here it is cascading off the side of a hillside at the Asheville Botanic Gardens. You know, it's a great idea to take a look at some plants that perhaps you haven't thought about before as ground covers and think about what you can use to fill in your gardens. Plants that will take a little bit of shade, that are short, they make excellent ground covers. And there's a lot of places I've mentioned during the presentation day where you can go and look for some great ideas about ground covers. Mount Cuba in Delaware, the Asheville Botanic Gardens are a great place to go. And here, this is the U.S. Botanic Garden of Eastern North American Plant Collection in the Bartholdi Park in Washington, D.C. A really terrific place to get some great ideas. It's a rather long URL, and I do apologize for this, but down at the bottom here, I've got a link to a list of ground covers that we've posted on our website that is based on this presentation, but there are some other ones in there that I didn't talk about as well, that gives a long list of some native ground covers that you might find useful to look at and think about ways to use ground covers in your garden and make every inch of your garden an ecologically productive space. So that's it. I think for once in my life, I kept pretty close to time. Elaine, I was pretty good on that.
I had no problem with you going on and on, but that was terrific, Randi. Thank you very much. And we do have quite a few questions. So if it's okay with you, we'll take a few minutes to.
Of course.
Do that. This one I found interesting. How can I tell Golden Alexander from goutweed?
Golden Alexander from goutweed. Well, that's one of those tough questions where, to me, they just look different.
The texture of the leaf is different.
Yeah, the texture of the leaf is different.
The shape is the same.
But you almost need them side by side by that if you don't know the difference. I don't have a quick answer for that one. That's a really good. I'm going to make a note.
I thought it was a very interesting question. Okay.
Well, I wish I had an answer for that one, but I'm going to make a note on that one so that next time somebody brings that one up, maybe I won't get stumped.
A couple of people have asked for a list of plants, but I want to reiterate what Randi said, that if you go to the Toadshade website, there is a list of plants that goes with this presentation.
Right.
And if you go, a long URL here.
If you go to our website, if you go to just toadshade.com, it's under resources. So if you just look under resources, one of those resources is native ground covers. It'd be nice if it had a cleaner looking URL than the one that's here, But if you go to there, just look under resources. One of those resources is the
Yeah.
Groundcovers.
So, and the toadshade, the toadshade, my questions are covering it. Yeah, it's just www.toadshade.com. So you can easily get a list of plants from this presentation. We have some general gardening questions, and I'll come back to those if we have time. But
Okay.
so let's do the specific ones. Okay, this was interesting because it's based on the book Planting in a Post-Wild World. Thank you for this talk. Can you please speak about using low-growing natives as a matrix layer amongst taller perennials in a native border bed? So the person is particularly interested in spacing, how you would do that if you're using the ground covers with sort of focal. I think what they mean is the focal talk about in that kind of a garden design, a matrix design.
Sure, it's I'm thinking, I didn't freeze.
No.
It's important to simply plan for them and use them as part of the original design and not think of them as an afterthought. Don't look at your focal points first and say, okay, I've got, this is what I want to look at. What am I going to fill the rest in with? You know, you need to think of the ground covers as another focal point layer in there. So it's it should be thought of as part of the original design. Now, a lot of people already have design gardens that are in there that have miles and miles of mulch underneath, and that's going to require some rethinking. And I don't know if this is answering your question, but it really needs to be thought of as part of the whole design, not an afterthought. The ground cover should never be an afterthought in the design. It should also be a focal point of the design.
I think that's a very good point. Somebody mentioned that they recently saw a Facebook post from a utility tree trimmer. This is another point against mulch. Who said that the workers sometimes use the chip truck as a restroom when necessary.
Oh, of course they do.
So it's another reason you might not want to.
Of course they do.
Okay. Okay. Here's a very specific spacing question, but I think you could turn it into a more general one. If shrubs need to be planted, say 5 feet apart to allow for their final size, what should be planted between them? I think what they mean is how many ground cover plants might you want to plant between them?
Well, yeah, I am going to turn that into sort of more general thought. So much like Doug Tallamy talks about the fact that we need to plant our trees together, not plant a tree and then plant the next one 25 feet away and plant the next one 25 feet away so that they all get their own special shape. That's fine for a specimen tree, but that's not how trees in a forest grow. And shrubs, likewise, should interplay with each other. You know, I'm not a fan of what I refer to as the gumdrop shrubs, where you have one little lump every 5 feet. So first of all, when you plant your shrubs, think about perhaps not planting them too regimented in their spacing. Plant them in groups. Allow them to rub up against each other and bump shoulders. They'll look better in the long run. But the other thing, and this is a really good point, is that in a new planting, particularly when you're talking about shrubs, which ultimately are going to cause a very dense shade underneath them, again, think about your ground cover, make it as part of the plan. Know that the ground covers that you're putting between your shrubs that are right now are looking for full sun ground cover. Well, once your shrubs start growing together, you may need to plan ahead and think about putting in a ground cover that's going to require more shade as more shade gets created in that garden. Some ground covers will simply move, which is sort of fun, as I was talking about with the Starry False Solomon plume. Sorry, Starry False Solomon seal. It was here, you know, a tree came down, it's now moving this way because there's more shade that way. So it's moving out of that area. And actually these striped cream violets are moving into its place because they're enjoying more sunlight there. So they are sort of switching places at this point, because next to it, there's a small, well, actually there's a flowering dogwood tree, which is recovering from the tree that came down that fell on top of it. It's now getting more leaves on it, but we're sort of trading shade spaces now. So not only plan for your garden, what it's going to look like next year, but you need to think about 5 years from now, particularly when you're talking about ground covers, because as it fills in, your ground covers are going to change and possibly move, and you may need to rethink that area.
Plants interact and serendipitous things happen. So
yes,
so it never looks quite the way you think it's going to look, but
no.
Yeah, which is part of the fun.
Nature finds a way.
Yeah, yeah. I found that the only thing that will hold back Canada anemone in my garden is wild ginger. It seems to form an impenetrable barrier. They meet and neither can go any further. So
you clearly have more moisture than I do.
No, it's like beach sand is what my soil is like. And this is in a dry place. Anyway, in a shady place rather. Can you recommend a ground cover for in between paving stones in a natural bluestone walkway? So a native ground cover that's in between, that's small enough to be in between paving stones. Shady in winter, sunny in growing season, clay soil.
I still call it by the old name, the 3-leafed cinquefoil would do wonderful there. We do not have it available right now. We're working on it. Did I mention it grows slowly? But it's really quite nice. If you can tolerate it. Violets are very nice in that space, but they're probably larger than you're looking for. Probably the best thing that I can think of is the 3-leaf cinquefoil. It's ideally suited for that space. Will work very well there and won't care about how that heat that you're going to get from the bluestones. As I said, we're working on, I'm actually planning on putting it between my bluestones this summer. I'm so excited about it. So it's a terrific species for that. And you know, if it starts to grow up over the bluestone, you walk on it, it'll just retreat.
How to contain lesser celandine. We were talking about this before we opened up, before we let people in.
So we're actually doing a little bit of, we're supplying plants for some research that is being done to try to see if lesser celandine can be shaded out. The problem being is that lesser celandine comes up extremely early in the spring. So it has to be something that's very dense and either evergreen or nearly evergreen. So the work that's being done, they're actually looking at burr sedge. It's a sedge I did not show today, which is Carex grayei. It is an evergreen sedge. It is a very dense growing sedge. It has leaves that are, probably more than a ½ inch wide. And by virtue of being semi-evergreen, it continues to shade the area. It's starting to regreen right now, but the old foliage is still there. So there's a project going out over in Union County where they're trying to see if they can outcompete the lesser celandine by using this dense growing evergreen sedge. We brainstormed quite a bit about a species that might work, and that's the one we came up with. So the jury is out on that one, but that is keeping my fingers crossed.
How about Papera aurea? Which you
it doesn't come up dense enough and thick enough fast enough.
For me, it's evergreen. That's what I'm trying it. I'm actually trying it.
Okay.
one of the ones.
Let me know how that works.
I will let you know, but
How that works.
yeah, because for me it's evergreen.
Because it's got to be really, the coverage has got to be really thick. But I'll be really excited to hear what your project.
Yeah, I had read that, so I'm trying it. I'm also trying Canada Anemone because for me it's very aggressive. Let me see. Will ground cover crowd out poison ivy?
Not if it's established. Because if it's established, poison ivy, which is a native plant, by the way, but not one that you necessarily want everywhere in your garden, and I grant you that. Poison ivy forms a pretty large woody structure underground. It has a nice burly root system underneath there, and it'll just overtop. The stems will come up, it'll overtop pretty much any ground cover that you have. I can't really think of one that's going to outcompete poison ivy. I think you're going to have to take care of that the old-fashioned way. Just make sure you wear really good gloves and long sleeves. I've pulled up a lot of poison ivy in my life. I do get poison ivy, but I find the gauntlet style gloves and long sleeves. I usually have one pair of designated poison ivy gloves every season to get out of the places where I don't want it.
It's a good idea. Yeah. I am, somebody says she is confused between creeping phlox and moss phlox. Can you talk about them a bit more?
Which was the first one, Elaine?
Creeping phlox and moss phlox.
Ah, okay. Yes. So moss phlox, I'm going to back up some slides. Let's see here. Moss phlox, let's see here. Where was it? I know it's here. All right, so there's moss phlox. Moss phlox, these leaves are needle-like, and it just forms a mat on the soil surface. This is the one that you often see. The horticulturalists have found this. You can get it in a variety of colors, but the wild one is usually this sort of a lavender purple. This is the straight species, but the needles are the leaves are very small, they're very fine and almost needle-like. Whereas creeping phlox, if you look over the left here, the leaves are, maybe the size of my thumb. And they're not they're a pleasant ground cover, but they're not, as a ground cover, it's not going to really outcompete anything. Creeping phlox is never going to outcompete or shade out any weeds. It will fill in nicely, be an attractive ground cover, but it's not really going to be competitive. Whereas moss phlox really forms quite a dense mat and can be fairly competitive against other plants. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Thank you. We are getting, a lot of these are general gardening questions, and I don't want to. Whoa, there's a lot of stuff there.
I went too far.
Yeah. A lot of questions are about what can compete with what can compete with creeping Charlie, what can compete with goutweed, what can compete with. So I'm not sure. Hang on. There are general gardening questions about, like, should you rake the leaves out? Should you shred the leaves? Should you? Yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about leaves.
No, yeah.
Let's talk about leaves and stems. So there was a gentleman I was talking to just today, actually. And he wanted to know if he should dethatcherize his lawn because there's all these dead leaves there on the ground. And I said, that's fertilizer. The leaves that come down, that breaks down and that turns to fertilizer for the soil. And he says, well, what if I remove all of that? I said, then you're going to have to fertilize. You're taking away your homegrown fertilizer. I don't remove leaves from my gardens, particularly woodland wildflowers and woodland ground covers. No one goes through our woods our forests, and they don't go out and rake the leaves. They decompose, they become part of the soil. And it's a disservice to our gardens to rake the leaves. As a child, I used to be very stressed about spring beauties because I was always afraid that the spring beauties would smother underneath the leaves in my mother's garden. They didn't smother underneath the leaves. They thought the leaves were great. They always find a way because that's the habitat. That's where they belong. That's where they grow. The shredding the leaves is unnecessary, first, and secondly, it actually hurts wildlife that's using those leaves. There are a lot of butterflies and moths. We tend to think about, because of monarchs, we tend to think about butterflies and being nice and flying away to Mexico and leaving us alone for the winter. But most of our butterflies and moths, most of our insects spend the winters in our gardens. Many of them in and amongst the leaves in your garden, some of them actually wrapped up in cocoons that look like the leaves in your garden. And so we take the leaves and we shred them and we put them back in the garden. You've just shredded your wildlife. And honestly, you're breaking the leaves down faster than they were designed to break down. Just rake your leaves in, it'll be fine, it'll look lovely.
Think of them as slow-acting fertilizer, not as
slow-acting fertilizer.
Not as quick-acting, non-organic fertilizer. But you don't
think of them as wood chip mulch and pretend they're wood chip mulch. It'll be fine.
Leave the leaves. Leave the leaves. I think we have. I'm sorry, my computer is making a lot of noise right now. I think those are all of the specific questions, and I thank you very, very much, Randi. As we said, you can get a list of plants on Randi's website. We are getting many, many thanks and people saying what a great talk it was, which it was. So thank you very much, and we hope to see the people who belong to our chapter or who attend our chapter events in person over the summer. You'll continue to get newsletters from us. Please join the Native Plant Society, of which Randi is now president. And thank you all very much for attending. So,
thank you very much, everyone. Yeah. Thanks for having me again, Elaine.
Oh, it's always a pleasure, Randi. Thank you for coming. We're going to stop recording and